Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Following several requests by our viewers, today we will discuss the situation in the North African state of Libya, a lawless country embroiled in chaos with direct implications to both Europe and the Middle East. I'm joined here in the studio by Dr. Nir Boms, a research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. Welcome.
Thank you.
I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Dr. Eran Lerman, Senior Research Associate at the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies and a faculty member of the Shalem Center or College. Welcome.
Thank you.
And I'd like to give you the opportunity, Mr. Oren, give us a little bit of an understanding how much of a challenging situation is Libya today.
It's a double challenge because this is a nexus of two problems. One is the fight against Daesh or ISIS, which goes on around the Middle East in general. And the other one is the makeup of the failed Libyan state. Here we are exactly 1 year after the Government of National Accord, the GNA, was set up on December 17th, 2015 in Morocco. And some 5 years after the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, and no real progress is in sight to bring order and governance to the Libyan nation, even though over the last few days, the victory at Sirte has been hailed as a very important event, which it was, but it's only one dot on a very long road.
I'd like to take a few steps backwards to give our viewers a little bit of an understanding of the situation and what came about since the fall of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. Dr. Boms, give us a little bit of an understanding on that.
So we need to begin with the Arab Spring, 2010, 2011, and the Middle East is engulfed in a series of revolutions. This begins in Libya as well. Soon enough, Colonel Gaddafi that holds tightly something which is today we understand as a more of an artificial state full of tribal forces that needs to be kept just with an iron fist. The spring unleashed some of these spirits, and soon enough, Libya, Yemen, Syria had found themselves in a series of civil wars, different factions fighting other factions, and tribal forces, local forces, and Islamist forces that came later on took reign and took control. This brings us to the situation that in 2014 we have some fighters. In 2012 we have some fighters going to Syria. They're coming back, additional influences, and then we begin to hear about Islamist groups, and soon enough some of them pledge allegiance to the Islamic State. They have a stronghold in one of the strongest places, and the most significant one is the city of Sirte, which we will speak, I assume, in a few minutes on the significant battle that just took place there. Soon enough, we see two parliaments, three governments, UN, other factors that are trying to mediate, not with much success, but certainly a very significant salad of forces. And at least now we're beginning to see the beginning of the end of one of them, the Islamic State of Libya.
Dr. Lerman, I'll also, again, take back a few steps. Dr. Boms mentioned the group's rebels, which were actually Western-backed rebels in the fight against Muammar Gaddafi. They left afterwards in order to battle the Assad regime together with their fellow Sunni Muslim brothers there. Came back afterwards after they were already embroiled in various battles, and after also they pledged allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi of the Islamic State and started collecting tribal forces and moving forward. Give us a little bit of an understanding.
First of all, let's remember that the Daesh element or the IS element in the Libyan story was not the central story. It is an important story precisely because it constituted a danger to European and international interests once they establish a presence on the Mediterranean coast, in Sirte and about 50 kilometers in each direction. But the reason they had this crack through which they could penetrate these relatively smaller forces that, some of them went to Syria and back, some were not even Libyan because IS actually has a policy against tamkin, against localization. They want their fighters to be from all over, wherever they come, wherever they fight. But all of this was a relatively minor aspect of a story that was largely about the split of Libya, first of all, along its historical constituent elements. This goes back to when the Italians fashioned together something that was never really a nation, from Tripolitania in the west, Cyrenaica, Benghazi in the east, and the Fezzan, the Saharan areas in the south, areas that never belonged together, that had a very dim view of each other. And the moment Gaddafi held them essentially through repression. Add to this the fact that the Libyan military, unlike the Syrian military, which, after all that we've seen, has actually remained a fighting force, the Libyan military was never good for anything. When Gaddafi was still in power, we used to joke about the Libyan disarmed forces, because he kept the forces in one place and the tanks elsewhere, so they never get ideas, you know. Mm-hmm. And so the basic thing is that once the country started falling apart, he relied on foreign mercenaries from all over Africa, and the rebels relied on foreign support, French, British mainly, the United States famously leading from behind. But once the West achieved its immediate aim, the destruction of the Libyan regime, which Clinton famously celebrated by saying, "We came, we won, he died," and then they left, and the whole thing started falling apart.
This point is actually very odd to me, as unlike Syria, Libya is a very oil-rich country. It's very significant both to Europe, for the United States and other countries in the region as well. How does the West come and make this shift of trying to oust a dictator, which it has a problem with, but then the moment he's down, they just step out?
Well, you say the West as if it's one whole, which has a policy, which has a mechanism to decide on guidance and then execute with popular support. None of those was there. And we remember back in 1986, when the Americans wanted to bomb Gaddafi, France didn't even allow them to fly over it. Libya was always a problem with Panam at Lockerbie, when it threatened Egypt, almost to the point where the Americans were encouraging Mubarak in the 80s to go out and attack Gaddafi, even though earlier Gaddafi wanted to unify Libya with Egypt under Sadat. Of course, his rule was very erratic. And you mentioned oil. Now, after the victory at Sirte, the Americans are encouraging the Libyans to reconstitute their oil industry in order to have some income to bolster their failed economy. But there was no unity of purpose between the Americans and the French and the Italians and all the rest. It only started over the last year when the Americans and the British and the Americans and the Tunisians helped them. Some of the drone attacks were launched from Tunisia, and the American and British special forces helped the militias at Sirte. So you see some gradual measures being taken, and you see the same stuff which took place in Iraq and in Syria. You had a dictator, he was removed, but no democracy evolved from that. And then the West came back trying to put Humpty Dumpty together.
I'd like to establish a clear picture. Dr. Boms, right now, as also Dr. Lehrman has stated, there are two main areas which are distant from each other, as the West is not very much agreeable regarding Libya. Libya domestically is also far apart, very tribal. Give us a little bit of an understanding. How far apart are they, and how significant each force is?
Well, we're looking at the eastern part and the western part, and remember that the majority of Libya is by the coast, and in that sense also closer to Europe and closer to the eye of the West. In the western part, we have some of the tribes and certainly a presence that is more Islamist. In the middle part, we have the beginning of the GNA, of the government, of the Western-backed United Nations government. And toward the east and toward the border of Egypt, we have seen both the forces of the former Libyan commander General Haftar and also the Islamic State that had been established presence there and now seems to be dissipating following the very significant campaign in Sirte.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Lohman.
Essentially, the two main fighting forces after all this sorting out of smaller forces that basically ended up being swallowed or associated with the two main fighting forces. One is the Misrata, the militias that originate from the town of Misrata, not far from Tripoli, and more populated and more homogeneous tribally, and therefore much more effective than the local Tripolitanian militias. And it is the Misratawis who did most of the fighting in Sirte. They have a local and tribal base, but they also have a sort of ideological association with the Muslim Brotherhood element within the GNA. The GNA is a composite government, the former Libya Dawn element and the former legitimate government unified under international pressure. At the other end, the other fighting force is the Libyan National Army under General Haftar. And Haftar, by now it's very clear, is Sisi's proxy. Mm-hmm. If the GNA is more or less being captured by a Muslim Brotherhood element, the Egyptians have no intention of allowing a Muslim Brotherhood state to control the border area, to have the run of the Bani Walid tribes, to be able to run guns and ammunition to their fellow members of the MB in Egypt. Mm-hmm. And therefore, Haftar has become a very important Egyptian ally. Now, add to this the new relationship between Sisi and Putin, and you understand how come Haftar has now been twice to Moscow for talks with Shoigu on arming his force. So Libya is now breaking once again, but along a different line. So once the IS is eliminated, it's Haftar and the Misratawis head-to-head.
We're going to touch base on both Sergei Shoigu's meeting with the Libyan general as well as the Egyptian interests there, but please give us a little bit more of an understanding. How much of a frontal conflict is it between those two sides?
There is a conflict between more than two sides, and the Americans are running this war or counter war from Germany, from the AFRICOM, the Africa Command headquarters, and they see the problem as part of a priority list for Africa. This is their second priority. The first priority is Somalia and Al-Shabaab. Mm-hmm. And all the rest comes after Libya. Now, they find themselves in a similar situation to what happened to them in Germany after World War II and in Iraq after the war. First, you cause the army to disintegrate, and then you want to reconstitute it. You had de-Baathification or denazification, and then you try to build the force. Here, it happened again. Because the government of national accord could not establish a proper mechanism to control the armed forces, because there are various armed forces, there is no commander-in-chief. The Prime Minister, Fayez Sarraj, is not the commanding chief of the military, and this is what they are trying to do now. Now, the Americans are trying to build another general who is in charge of the Presidential Guard, a brigadier general. But obviously, Sisi is going to get his wish, and Haftar is probably going to end up as the supreme military commander.
Dr. Boms?
And let's add to that one additional interesting dimension, which is connected to the war against ISIS, the Islamic State. What the Americans have done, and in many ways they have done that not only in Libya, is to prioritize the fight against the Islamic State, and they have done so using AFRICOM, bombing over 500 times, and eventually enabling the victory in Sirte. But as Dr. Lohman had said, that's not necessarily the main problem of Libya. And the prioritization of ISIS and almost the neglect of everything else means that what's going to happen next is that all of these players, certainly the Americans, because the Russians and the Egyptians have already recalculated their moves, will find themselves again at the question, okay, so who are we going to support next? It seems that the Russians in Libya, in Syria, have calculated in many ways have the upper hand. ISIS may be not necessarily gone, but certainly dissipated and moved, and perhaps they would move closer to the Al-Qaeda type attempts as they began, and you'll see more of them in Europe and perhaps in other places with terrorist attacks, which are going to take them back to the core of a terrorist organization. The Americans at that point will find themselves with much less influence in both arenas, and the Russians will have the upper hand, which certainly takes you back to the recent meeting with Haftar in Moscow.
Dr. Lehrman, is this an international playground for world powers, or is this different from what we can see in Syria?
Well, it's nothing like the Syrian situation, because in the Syrian situation you have one major power, not let's not exaggerate Russian power, but I think there's a tendency sometimes to equate the Russians with the Americans or the Chinese. That's a mistake. But the Russians are using one specific location to demonstrate that they are still in the game. They're not in a position to do so in Libya. However, they are very bitter about their mistake in allowing United Nations Security Council Resolution 1973 to go through, and basically dropping the ball because the Americans and the French and the British just took it as a mandate to finish Gaddafi off. And the Russians remain very bitter about that mistake. What they are doing in Syria is to prove that they will not allow this to happen again. Now you have a situation where the Americans, to some extent the Italians, the British, have helped the Misratawis win in Sirte, whereas the French and the Russians are closer to the Egyptian position in support of Haftar. All of this could lead in two very different directions, and much will depend on what happens after January 20th. It could lead to further confrontation, with each side playing for support, or it could lead to a deal in Libya based on a larger agenda, American-Russian agenda, that focuses on commonalities rather than on tensions, which could very well happen.
Mr. Oren?
We are probably too pessimistic here in our analysis because we live in the Middle East and we've seen many hopes shattered, so we'd rather err on the cautious side. But one must point out that the East is a success story on two levels. First of all, this is part of the trend which we see in Mosul and Raqqa too, and Sirte is part of that, that the Islamic State is being rolled back. So one shouldn't downgrade this part. And the other one is that if Libya is to some extent being stabilized, it means that Tunisia and the entire North African region will be in less risk of being destabilized, and it will not flare up the way we feared a couple of years ago.
Dr. Boms?
Okay, the campaign against the Islamic State may be indeed a success, but there are other no less radical forces in the region, in Libya. There are other local militias, there are other Islamist militias, and it's not very clear what will happen after the ground base of the Islamic State. And certainly now we're approaching the Battle of Raqqa, and it may be the beginning of the end of the Islamic State as an entity that controls a piece of territory. We're not sure what will happen with that infrastructure, but what we know from history is that most likely they're not going to disappear. They can surprise us. They have recently did in Tadmir, bring in 4,000 people and showing that they still have some strength. And some of them may change strategy and continue, not just in Libya or in Syria, but also elsewhere in the region. So I think the stability is going to be still a far vision. And I'm not sure that the Russians or the Americans or others actually have the answer of what might be there. And I don't think that we will, after the Islamic State is gone, that we're actually about to see a more stable period there. I think we're going to have to face other actors, and that fight is going to continue, sometimes despite the fact that there are going to be attempts to bring a certain political or a ceasefire agreement into place.
And Dr. Lehrman, as to the implications on its neighbors, particularly Egypt. We've heard Abdel Fattah el-Sisi on several platforms cry out for international aid in combating both the Islamic State as well as other organizations within Libya, as well as stemming the flow of foreign fighters into Egypt, which is also embroiled in several conflicts with Wilayat Sina, the Islamic State branch in the Sinai Peninsula, as well as other organizations. Give us a little bit of an understanding, how much of a significance does Libya have to the unstable situation in the Middle East?
Look, given that Sudan has changed sides, and the Egyptians can feel relatively confident that Bashir now belongs to the right side in the game of camps in the region. They basically defected from the pro-Iranian to the Saudi. I don't know how much this cost the Saudi treasury, but it was done. So in the south, he's feeling safe. Mm-hmm. In Sinai, he can win the war, although he's doing it in a very Egyptian methodical way, in other words, rather slowly, but he's winning. The main danger to stability in Egypt is the huge arsenals of conventional weapons that are lying about in Libya and could be smuggled through the Western Desert, the landscapes of 1942, particularly because there's a large tribal element, the Bani Walid, which straddle the border. So for him, Haftar's control, his proxy's control of the Benghazi area and Cyrenaica is the one important thing. It's much less important to him, I believe, to gain control of Tripoli. And ultimately, I think there will be a kind of practical balance, because the Tripolitanian elements and the Misratawis cannot take Benghazi, and Haftar has no prospect of taking the West. So under some kind of some kind of fictitious unity, these elements will probably be glued together in a way that that can look like a state, although it's really in effect will be two very different governments. One destabilizing element is that an important player here, not anywhere else, but here it definitely is Italy. And the Italians have enabled the Americans to operate. The Italians have pushed for a more robust European and international position on Libya, with Italy now going into what looks like a prolonged political crisis. The ability for the Italians to play the role that Renzi played in pushing the various Libyan factions together will be much more limited in the coming months, which is a pity.
Mr. Oren.
2 points. One has to do with oil. If there is a windfall, perhaps what happened in Iraq, where you have the Kurdish autonomy getting the benefit of its income and therefore playing a moderating role on the government, perhaps this could also happen in Libya if there is a share the wealth program. The other one is a more regional lesson. Apparently, you don't have majority rule. You have either the military or the monarchy. These are the only countries in the region, with the exception of Israel, where you have effective rule. And even the Assad family, of course, started with Hafez Assad, who was an Air Force general. So if Haftar takes over, General Haftar, with the assistance of General Sisi, and you have the monarchies elsewhere, it will not bode well for democracies in this region for many years.
Dr. Boms, another point that is of interest is the migrants. There are plenty of boats going out of Libya towards EU member states. Lots of images, of course, are coming out with regarding to bodies of people who have drowned in the Mediterranean Sea and not made it to the European Union. Give us a little bit of an understanding, how much of an issue is that right now, and how much of a point of strategic value does this hold for the Europeans in combating whatever is happening in Libya?
It is very significant, and again, not just in the context of Libya. Mr. Oren said that it's either the majority or the military. I think in these cases it's more the militant, and these militants are driving people away simply because the pictures that you see on the seas for those who are trying to escape pictures that are even more horrible, and as we recently have seen them, not just in Libya, certainly in the last few days, in Halab, in Aleppo, in Syria. For the Europeans, this is a very significant issue. The Syrian conflict, the Libyan conflict, the other conflicts in Africa had brought over 2 million refugees into the gates of Europe. Some of these refugees, as again, recent history taught us, were not always the friendliest. Aside of the integration issues, some of them also came from militant groups, and some of them began to influence a number of arenas of terrorism and radicalizations in Europe. So that's obviously a very significant European interest. There is the human rights and the human dimension of saving some of these people, of these horrible pictures of people drowning, and these smugglers who take them on boats that cannot carry them to the other side of the Mediterranean. And then the issue of trying to bring some degree of stability in one way or the other, and basically to make it stop. One state, two states, three states, and a discussion that is very familiar here, try to figure out one way or the other to bring some degree of stability to this troubled region.
Dr. Lerman?
The Libyan situation is unique in that many of the refugees who try to make their way over to the very short hop to Italian territory in Pantelleria and Sicily are actually not Libyans escaping conflict, but sub-Saharan Africans who are using the chaos on the Libyan borders to basically infiltrate where they can no longer do so from Morocco or Tunisia. And therefore, the question of the traffickers, the professional traffickers, has become a separate set. And there is a UN Security Council resolution authorizing the use of force against them. There is a European operation, Operation Sophia, authorized by a series of EU resolutions to use military forces to destroy these boats, these smuggler boats, on shore before they sail, based on intelligence. And that will remain an issue regardless of the political developments in Libya itself.
Mr. Oren, with regard to implications on Israel, indirect implications?
Well, it's sad to recall that only 6 years ago or so, there was the so-called Mediterranean dialogue that NATO held. There was also the Barcelona process, this dream of a Mediterranean character or identity in which Israel took part along with several North African states, Egypt and Jordan. Libya was not part of it. Now it is all shattered. The Russians are in the Mediterranean, in Syria and in Libya, and one does not see a revival of this spirit.
Well, this is all the time that we have, unfortunately.
And Cypriot.
We will have to make another program about this topic in order to continue to discuss this, because there's plenty to talk about. Dr. Nir Bohm, thank you so very much for coming. Mr. Amir Oren and Dr. Eran Lerman, it's been a pleasure. Thank you also very much to our viewers, and we will see you next week. TV7 Israel's mission is to give you, our viewers, truthful information, which in effect will give you a chance to really understand what is happening in Israel and its region. If you're blessed by our programs and believe our mission to be important, we urge you to support us and become a voice for Israel. You can support us by going to our website at tv7israelnews.com. This program was made possible through your donations.